My name is Brianna Vecchioni. I am currently a PhD student in information science at Cornell. And today I'm going to talk about some joint work done with Karen Levy and Solon Barocas about the history of audit studies and some of its implications for algorithmic auditing. So broadly, audit studies are field experiments that allow researchers to test for discrimination, where a researcher will randomize a characteristic or multiple characteristics about either real or hypothetical individuals, and will then send these individuals into some field setting to see the effect of those characteristics. And the advantage of conducting a study like this is that researchers are then able to explore scenarios and make more rigorous claims that may not be possible to answer using data that is purely observational. And interestingly, audit studies actually stem from questions about discrimination in the social sciences. And in the past decade or so, there's been an increasing push to subject algorithms to audit, right, due to this increased awareness of problematic behaviors, particularly with respect to discrimination. But this rapid growth has made the meaning of the term somewhat ambiguous, and there are many conversations about what an audit should entail, as well as what an audit should eventually deliver. So as it stands, an audit is often referred to as any empirical investigation, regardless of the fact that they often focus on very different research questions and involve very different measurement techniques. And to some degree, this makes sense due to the fact that the term audit can refer to a very broad range of activities. So some examples of these are possibly legal investigations by government tax authorities or compliance-oriented inspections by accounting firms. But again, interestingly, social scientific audits have this long history and are used to study discrimination. But even in discussions around how auditing in the social science works, there's this historical debate about what methods we should use and how to actually study discrimination. And so while recent efforts referring to algorithmic auditing have given us really important methodological recommendations and have also raised challenging questions about what algorithmic audits should or could encompass, our aim is to complement these efforts by drawing lessons from the history of audit studies, which actually originate in the social sciences. So we asked broadly, how can we draw from the history of social science audit studies when considering what role we want algorithmic audits to play in advancing social justice? And in doing this, we hope to learn lessons from the past in order to help us better reflect on the future, and in particular, by drawing from tensions within the social sciences about the aims and capabilities of audit studies. And then by describing their implications in the context of algorithmic audits and what role we want algorithmic audits to play with respect to the advancement of social justice. And we want to note that a lot of our analysis is inspired by the very valuable insights from Francis Cherry and Mark Bendick's work on discrimination auditing and the activist scholar tradition. And we do this in two stages. So first, we introduce how auditing in the social sciences is rooted in social justice aims. And then we provide key considerations as to what this history actually implies for us in the context of algorithmic auditing. So we're going to start with the social justice origins. So in the 1940s and the 1950s, it was very common for civic organizations to partner with researchers, which reveals its origins in participatory action research, which is basically when participants will help co-design and co-execute a study led by researchers. And this kind of endorses the with, not for mentality, where more valuable knowledge can be attained by actually directly involving the communities of interest in order to better serve their needs and their goals. And so the types of methods that were used during this time were often rooted in communities, and this included survey methods as well as audits. Community self-surveys were actually common, which is when community members themselves collect data through either in-person or telephone interviews. And the idea here is that participant engagement can help build trust and spur actionable reform. So one notable example comes from the 1951 manual called How to Conduct a Community Self-Survey of Civil Rights. And this promotes researcher community partnerships by arguing that self-obtained knowledge leads to better citizen participation. And one of the authors of this book is a researcher named Claire Seltes, who also conducted this well-known test case auditing Manhattan restaurants for racial discrimination. And in this case, testers from the Committee on Civil Rights of East Manhattan were trained and then set out into a restaurant to observe how they were treated by the staff. And ultimately, they found differential treatment by seating Black testers in more undesirable locations and providing poor service. And so action was actually then taken on these findings, which included sending letters to owners and managers, holding meetings between establishments. They issued a press release, participated in radio interviews, and more. But over time, this enthusiasm for these community researcher partnerships to study discrimination ended up waning. And one of these reasons was because they were resource intensive, right? So you have to enlist people to participate, you then have to train them, then you have to send them out into the field with these seemingly identical characteristics that then vary according to whatever variable of interest, like race and gender, for example. And quantitative modeling actually became more popular across the social sciences, which provided the advantages of more statistical or methodological rigor. And in-person audits are just hard, right? Because even if you manage to control for factors like age or physical appearance and features that are similar, it's still entirely possible to exclude relevant differences between testers, which can ultimately confound the study. And so by the 2000s, housing and employment applications increasingly took place over the internet. So researchers began conducting more correspondence audits. And correspondence audits afford researchers increased control over the variables and can also be conducted at a much broader scale. So this design enables researchers to rely on fictitious correspondence by creating fictitious individuals, either online or by mail, while varying the characteristics of these applicants in order to test for discrimination. So one very famous example I'm sure all of us are familiar with of this correspondence audit is by Bertrand and Mullainathan. And in this study, researchers sent out 1,300 job ads through fax and mail by sending 4 systematically varied resumes to employers, and ultimately found that resumes from Black applicants were about 50% less likely to receive a callback than white applicants. And so this was important that it demonstrated scale that was unprecedented at the time, showing that large-scale correspondence audit could be done with only a few researchers, right? Well, it's important to note that correspondence studies, of course, face their own methodological limitations and what we can learn, and that ends up being instructive for algorithmic audits, which is what we're going to talk about next. So now we're going to talk about the key considerations for the future of algorithmic auditing. And our first observation is that social science audit studies can make claims only about discrete moments in time where bias can emerge in the process. So for example, a lot of correspondence studies related to hiring focus on the decision to call back an applicant for an interview based on their resume. However, earlier and later processes of the hiring process are actually not captured. And so while correspondence audits have the benefits of being rigorously controlled, as well as demonstrating effects that are statistically significant, they really only offer what we're referring to as this thin slice view of where discrimination may occur in a process. And similar concerns arise in the context of algorithmic auditing. So some scholars argue for the investigation of the entire system for a criterion such as fairness, which motivates the potential for end-to-end audits that can then account for operational and social aspects of use alongside these technical considerations. Algorithmic audits which claim to have met some criterion, such as fairness or quality, then assume the best case scenario, but there's actually ample evidence that suggests that these best case assumptions about how an algorithm is used may not actually hold up empirically. And so the key point here is that audits might be most meaningfully deployed to assess bias in actual and not optimal conditions of end-to-end use. And lastly, audits typically assess episodic incidents of discrimination. So for example, one job search or one credit application, instead of discrimination that may accrue more cumulatively. And this is important to consider, given the fact that we know discrimination can cause harm over time and not just in single instances, right? And it's also important to consider what type of knowledge an audit seeks to produce. And for instance, you could look to assess this state of the world knowledge, which is how much discrimination is present in the labor market. And audit studies in the social sciences tend to favor this approach, which makes sense, right? Because of their emphasis on describing the world. You could also look for specific knowledge about the practices of a particular entity. So for example, an employer or a landlord or a credit provider, for instance. But algorithmic audits are not in person, and they can have a variety of forms, right? Such as sock puppets, where computers can impersonate testers, or scraping techniques, which enable then specific entities to be tracked down. And it's possible to imagine that communities affected by discrimination are actually less interested in this state of the world knowledge and more interested in knowledge which can be targeted at specific institutions where discrimination has been identified, because it can then support subsequent action. And these goals lead to very different study designs. So oftentimes contemporary audit studies are unpaired. This is when the treatment and control testers are sent to different recipients who are chosen randomly, and then the outcomes are statistically analyzed to assess the amount of discrimination that is experienced collectively. And when conducting a paired audit, a recipient evaluates two applicants who are matched on all characteristics, except for this variable of interest. And Cherry and Bendick make this note about how unpaired audits are subject to this villainy without villains problem, and that they don't identify specific discriminating decision makers, which is actually not the case for algorithmic audits, right? So algorithmic audits often do focus on an identifiable system, which then enables the potential for this social activist use. And it's also worth noting that in-person audits provide more of a narrative in that they can convey stories and statistics. And some of the well-known algorithmic audits have relied on storytelling as well. And so I'm going to use arguably one of the most famous examples, the Compass Risk Assessment. And even though this is not formally considered an audit, this is the case where, for those of you who are unfamiliar, ProPublica combined this statistical analysis with stories from actual individuals who were subjected to its decision-making, right? So unlike in-person audits, no real person is subjected to biased treatment in correspondence studies. So there's this trade-off between in-person and correspondence studies because ultimately you lose the abilities to tell stories you get from this in-person approach. And we argue that a combined approach may actually lend itself better to policy impacts that are able to better support social change and serve community goals. And so it's also reasonable at this point to ask what meaningful community engagement could look like in algorithmic auditing, and specifically how researchers could collaborate with communities when designing and executing these approaches. And so one way where this might be effective is through crowdsourced audits, where researchers ask for participation from volunteers who can then share their data with these researchers. And so one example here is the use of the GDPR's subject access rights, where any individual can get a record of their personal data and how it's been used in any automated decision-making systems. And then these individuals can then donate their data to researchers so that they can use these data in aggregate when they're auditing for discrimination. Another option is through bug bounty programs, which is a crowdsource-based model that offers researchers financial incentives for identifying security vulnerabilities. And so one example of this is Twitter's Algorithmic Bias Bug Bounty Challenge, which was launched earlier this year. And this asks the researcher and hacker communities to help identify bias in their image cropping algorithm. And this was actually a result of an organic audit, which we identify as a community-led effort that arises when bias is perceived in a public-facing algorithm and is often disseminated through social media. And this was also the case when researchers took to Twitter to test this image cropping algorithm for racial bias. So ultimately, it's important for researchers and practitioners to consider how to balance community-based and researcher-led approaches. And so the advantages of community-based auditing include things like being able to reveal potential biases or test cases that may be overlooked by internal auditors. It also helps to foster community awareness as well as mobilization, and therefore greater public accountability. And we want to encourage further exploring how to combine community-led and researcher-led approaches in a collaborative way, possibly by using the community to surface suspicious cases that can then become the basis for more rigorous studies by researchers. Another idea is collecting data from a representative panel, for instance, which then gives the researcher more control, and then that they can address concerns about not selecting test cases in a way that's more systematic. And so we want to end with a few takeaways. Our main takeaway here is that there's actually a lot of value in learning about the history of audit studies, and that it helps us surface considerations that those who audit algorithms should be attentive to. And based on this history, we want to be asking all sorts of questions, like how to define and measure discrimination, how to consider the advantages of involving real people, and how to enable meaningful engagement from affected people and communities. So I'll stop there, and thank you so much.